Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arline Sachs and this is Sallyann Sachs. And today we're going to go back and look at some of the things that a beginner would need to do. Really the very, very first thing that you want to do when you begin to think about genealogy. And sometimes it helps to look back at that and review some of it. So we're going to look today at oral history and how that becomes important in trying to trace your family roots.
Well, you know, the professionals say that the first thing you do is to interview yourself.
That sounds very strange, doesn't it?
Well, they mean write down everything you know about your information, your parents, your grandparents. But before we get to that, what we're writing down, I would like to say that the way I think of doing genealogy research is that there is what I call the oral information and the written information. And the two are both necessary. You can't do one without the other, and neither is more important than the other from my viewpoint.
But I think the oral is what you want to do first.
You must start with the oral because
those people aren't going to be around very long.
Exactly. The papers will be there when you get to them, but the people might not be. So you start with the
oldest people that you, well, first, as you said, you write down what you know yourself, who your parents are, who your grandparents are, if they're alive. Talk to them as soon as possible.
Right.
Don't put it off.
And then you say to yourself, what do I want to ask them?
Yeah.
So there's sort of the skeleton for the genealogist.
Well, first you want to ask the basics.
The vital statistics.
Names, places, things like that. And then later on you're going to get more of the family.
So my list goes like this. Where were you born? When were you born? If you're married, whom did you marry? When and where? For those who are dead, when did they die? Where did they die? Where are they buried? Then I have the next list after that.
Well, we've got a lot of questions to go through that we can talk about.
Okay, here's your list. What do you have there?
Well, what was the name of the parents, grandparents? But before that, although I have it listed as what was the name of your parents, when you ask, you want to be a little bit more specific. What was the name of your mother? What was the name of your father? What was your name of the mother's father, and so on.
And did they change their names at any point? And when you're doing Jewish genealogy, what is their Hebrew name?
Well, the reason you want to ask one at a time, too, is because otherwise the person you're talking to will focus on one, and then you'll lose the other one, and you'll forget that they didn't talk about it. So you want to be at least to begin with, specific.
Arline, with your German background, I can expect that. With my Russian background, I'm not so sure that I'm so specific.
Well, again, we know that there's various ways of interviewing, and there are professional interviewers who will say you must follow a set of questions and only interview one person at a time. And yet others of us have found it's better to interview with a couple of people because they jog each other's memories.
Absolutely, or a combination of both.
So you have to work it out, and you have to get to know the person that you're interviewing and see what they're...
The other thing to remember is that you and I already know this. After age 50, you have a hard time retrieving proper nouns. Yeah. So sometimes if you say to somebody straight out, what was the name of your... and they go blank. And they'll say, I don't know, I don't know. That's the danger with being too specific. You get a lot of I don't knows. Whereas if you can get them talking, this is a psychologist speaking to you now. If you get them talking, a lot more comes out. You listening may not be as... The orderly you won't be as happy because you can't fill in all your things, but that leads to the other thing about recording.
Yes, well, there's two ways of doing it, obviously, or obviously just taking notes, oral, just a tape recorder, or a video of some kind. And it's important that the person not realize that they're... You have to tell them, but you may need to make them forget it.
Because if you're recording.
Because when we did my mother-in-law, and she saw the video record, she started sitting like this and speaking very carefully, and we said, just forget this, we're going to turn it off. So we went over and pretended to turn it off, and it was fine, and recorded everything.
That's right, exactly.
Because you don't want her to be formal, you want it, to be able to think and talk and interact with you. And I guess most people today would use a video recorder, tape recorders as sort of...
Well, except that some people are more comfortable with the tape recorders. I mean, because they're less obtrusive. Yeah.
But if you can set a video recorder up on a tripod and just tell them, I had this here, I'm not going to use it, and just let it run.
The other thing, of course, is there is for many people, there's a certain pleasure in knowing that someday there's going to be this tape of them, even after they're not
Again,
here
you have
anymore.
to know the person and know what they feel.
And of course, you can't do that to a woman without warning her that you're going to do it so that her hair is okay.
Well, you know, I wouldn't do it, you know, with a hidden camera or something like that that they wouldn't know about. But you want to hide it to the extent that they're not totally focused on this thing and look at you.
So in terms of who do you interview? As you said, you go to the oldest relatives first because we all have too many stories of people we waited too long to interview, or in my case, there's a handful of people I interviewed and a month later they were gone.
Yeah,
it was just amazing. And the other thing, of course, is don't forget to interview close family friends. That surprised me. When I first started, my maternal grandmother died when my mother was only 16. So when I got around to interviewing to doing that line, I said to my mother, "Where was your mother born?" And she wasn't sure. She said, "It sounds like it was Hungary, that place where paprika comes from." Well, a place where paprika comes from is Szeged. But for some reason, that wasn't quite right. And then my mother had a memory. She said, "You know, I remember starting kindergarten." My mother took me to the first day of kindergarten. As we were walking in, she suddenly gave a shriek, and my grandmother and this other woman rushed to each other and hugged and kissed. They had been childhood friends, and each had emigrated to Cleveland, Ohio without knowing that the other one had. And my mother said to me, "I think Mrs. whatever her name was is still alive." She was 90-some years old. We found her son. He talked to his mother, and he came back and said the town was Szeged, not Szeged. But you see, these that kind of thing can be.
Yes.
Or if I had asked my grandfather, who was still alive, where his wife had been born, if I had the wit to think of that.
And I know I found out a lot about my mother and her life from my aunt.
Of course.
Who I only met one time in her life because she was still in Germany. But she could tell me things about my mother's childhood and explain why things happened to my mother as they did, because she lost her birth mother when she was 2 and was treated as Cinderella. And so, you know, you need to find out these things, and you're not going to, my mother would never have admitted that.
Exactly. And so,
never, ever.
And there's a bunch of stuff. Oh, that's the family secrets story. Okay. And every family has their secrets, right?
Yeah. My
father had a brother who died mysteriously, and my sister and I were always very curious. Well, we had one aunt who would tell. Let's
go back, and I know we've got these marvelous stories, but let's look at some of the things that people should be asking. Okay, first we established names and things like that. What were their occupations? Where did they live? Who did they marry and things like that. And let's say they lived, as you said, in Cleveland or New York or something. If you look at the censuses then, and you can find other names of people that lived there, ask them about them, because they could have been relatives,
yes,
especially when people first came over. If they worked the same apartment, it was the next door apartment.
Well, they were called boarders, and they very often were relatives. That's a very good point. And also, in terms, again, of Jewish genealogy, who they're named after when you're doing names.
Absolutely.
And whose memory are you named? Because that gives you a chain of generations that's very important.
In that case, we're lucky. We're better off than a lot of people because we have that to follow.
Oh, yes. That's very important. And also, of course, you want to list their children. Not only occupations, but children are very important. And, of course, if they were immigrants, when did they come here? And
why? What prompted the move? Because it could have been a pogrom.
But very often those stories I have found are a little bit suspect. Usually.
Well, those are so long ago at this point too.
And you create memories. You know, you can create memories.
But they, you know, if there was, and they might remember. Well, of course, I don't think there's anybody alive anymore that remembers the old pogroms.
Right.
But that's the kind of thing that you want to find out, and who came with them too.
Oh, indeed.
Because so often, from Eastern Europe in particular, the whole shtetl moved. Who decided that you're coming?
Right. That was a very good point. Some of the other information, I want to go back though to the secrets, because people did a lot of fudging.
Yeah.
And they don't for adoption. was one of the questions.
Oh yes, you never talked about adoption. If you
No, you didn't talk about adoption. And also the question for us later, ethically, is when we find out somebody was adopted, do we write it in the book when we finally do our book?
I found, I knew somebody in a group, she was in her 80s, and she said she found out she was adopted when she was about 60 when she applied for a passport. And her parents had never ever told her about it.
Oh yes.
And somehow when she applied for a passport, I guess when she became a citizen with her father's, it was listed there, and she never knew about it before. So yes, it was definitely kept secret forever.
Yes. Well, the fact that my uncle was killed gangland style because he was running whiskey over Lake Erie during Prohibition, and he cheated on the mob. I mean, that was a story.
That's a neat story. You wouldn't talk about it then, though.
No, they didn't talk about it. It was traumatic. But I found it in the newspaper, in old newspapers. But you keep your ears open for, and you know, this question of interviewing and the video. One of the other disagreements between the professionals about whether you have a set format or an open-ended discussion, the other is, do you interview people one at a time or in a group? And as we have both found, when my father and his living siblings were all together, one person jogged another person's memory. Sometimes they made somebody more honest, you know, somebody was telling it and the other one said, no, it wasn't really like that. So I found that a combination, and also going back to people. Recently, I'm working now on the issue of Avotena where we do the human interest stories. So I have a bunch of great stories right now on my computer. And one of them that stands out is how this woman who's been working for 25, 30 years and now has solved all this just recently, she would go back to her aunts and uncles and tell them what she had learned. And when she told them, then they said, oh, there was somebody with that name who was somehow a relative. He had a deli in Manhattan. The deli in Manhattan was the clue that unraveled the whole thing for her. But you see, you can't get that kind of information with a direct question.
No, and you can't get it on probably cannot get it on one session either, because the first time you're going to need those specifics: birth, marriage, death. The second time you can ask further questions, and like when we did Sid's mother-in-law, this was not an interview at all, but one of the things that hit me and that I remember the most. She was visiting us. My son was in the room with her. I was in another room, and he says, "Granny, tell me, what was a special moment in your life growing up?" And she talked about the Wright brothers demonstrating the airplane in Chicago at Soldiers Field, and it just blew my mind. Here is a person that lived before airplanes all the way to past going to the moon.
Right.
And
what
yet,
she had seen.
And my mother lived just about the same time, and well, she didn't see the Wright brothers because she was in Germany, but she did have a similar memory that her father took her to the airport to see the airplanes.
Or I can think of a story where somebody was talking about the World's Fair. Well, that pinned us in a certain place at a certain time, which had been vague beforehand, and that's important too.
If she was a young girl, she couldn't have been. I mean, she would have had to be old enough to remember it and for it to make an impression on her.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. So the family stories, I think, are tremendously important.
In fact, the fact that my mother-in-law saw the Wright brothers, we were able to pinpoint it by going through newspapers and stuff when the Wright brothers were in Chicago. So we got a fairly good date on it.
You made a note to yourself to be sure to say is with this electric equipment that we're using, make sure it's turned on. Make sure it's working. How many times have we thought we've taped a session and we have nothing? And also, make notes of things. Something may have, as you're listening, sometimes when they start talking, you don't want to interrupt. But something will, at the corner of your consciousness, you'll notice something and you'll want to get back to it.
To make a note of it. You certainly should have paper and pencil in addition to any tape recorder. But another thing that you can do when you're doing interviews is have old photos, especially family pictures or group pictures where they can point out who the other people are.
And some of these old photos are not identified. It's very nice when people identify them, which of course reminds us to always identify what we can. The other thing that I like to ask is, when you were a child, what family events did you go to? What weddings did you go to? What bar mitzvahs? What funerals? What when did the family get together, and tell me the names of all the people who were there. I can't tell you the number of names I had where, when I started out, didn't know who they were. We didn't know how I remember one woman saying they were somehow related, I don't know how. But you have this list.
Yeah, and
over time, some of that is your very best connection. Or that same woman said to me, you know, we were in San Antonio, Texas, and such and such and such and such, and somebody who had a shoe store turned out to be a relative. Well, I called it the synagogue in San Antonio. And it was, I won't give you the whole story, but it opened up a whole branch.
Wow.
Same story in Boston, another whole branch, where somebody walked into a store and there was this greeting and blah, blah, blah. You want those stories because
that puts the family together, and it puts flesh on, as they say, flesh on bones, because otherwise it's just names, and you really, you know, okay, it's another name, but when you find out something that they really did in real life, or how they lived, or
well, haven't you noticed over the years that many of us don't really say we're doing genealogy, we're doing family history,
yeah,
which is really a much more filled out. We get the people in 3 dimensions that way.
Yeah.
And in fact, the articles that I've gotten, one of them, the title is My Faceless Grandfather. And he says, I had the birth and death and marriage, but I still didn't have a feeling for the man. And he talks about how he found newspaper articles. So many people are using old newspapers that now they've become more and more accessible. They're on microfilm or the New York Times.
Well, the same thing with the census records, but we'll go into that. We'll get into that. But how much that has changed through the use of the web, and what you can do, what you couldn't do.
But the orientation being not simply genetically connected, but who were these people? How did they live? And of course, as you learn that, you learn lots more stuff.
Yeah.
Like, you know, the thing about family stories, you know, that they say there's a grain of truth in every story, and you've probably found that. The details may be not accurate, but there's something there that's true in
something
all those.
Started it.
That's right.
Something started it, like whatever.
Except, yes, except that my name was changed at Ellis Island probably isn't true.
But
that's a pervasive one.
I don't even try to correct somebody anymore when they say that, because
I'm still correcting them.
You'll just end up in a big argument because, oh no, I'm positive that's what happened. Okay.
Yes, but you know, we know that the manifests were made out in Europe before they got here. So what other kinds of things? Oh, the other important thing is before you finish, you say to them what we say to the people on the show when we interview them. Is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have asked you? Yes, because they might be thinking of something else that you don't know enough to ask. Exactly. And that's, well, tremendously important. Like, oh, and we left out who were your parents and stuff, but names of brothers and sisters, siblings and nieces and nephews, and go on. Go back. You want to go up and down and horizontally. Yeah. Because that helps you get back further very often. So, sure, I mean, the fact that somebody was a twin might not be known to you, or something. Or that a twin died early. Otherwise, you probably would know, but maybe not. Yeah. But did something happen, or oh, sure. And now, of course, with the DNA studies, when we get back some of these that show that somebody who should be the son of somebody has totally different DNA, oh, that becomes an interesting. I haven't. Well, you haven't come across that one yet. Well, it's only since it's been tested. We don't have. I mean, he has his brothers, but we didn't bother doing. You know, they're not interested. So, but he's come up with some interesting results. The other thing you might consider doing for interviewing is if you have a rare name, and you decide to look for people with that same name. I sent out questionnaires to all the people with the name Shulkin in the U.S. phone books, and got back quite a lot of information, which at first I couldn't do anything with. And over the years, it's like the jigsaw puzzle coming together. We put the people together. I tried that about 15 years ago with Astheimer, my maiden name. And they almost
all of them, I wrote to several where they said, oh, you also wrote to my brother and my father,
Yes.
and so on. They almost all came from Pennsylvania. A number of them said that they thought there might be Jewish, they might have been Jewish, but nobody was Jewish at this point anymore. I have since found, that was before I got the list of all the Jews in Ostheim, which was one big family. And I just never had the time to go back and put those two things together. So maybe one day I'll try it again.
That would be a good thing to put together.
Because mostly they knew, the people here in this country, but I have the list of, I don't know what happened to these people. Maybe it's some of those that came, because it was mid-1800s, which would have been when the German...
The interest, and knowing, it's so important to know context, to know the history of the region and so on. I had a girlfriend in college. Her last name was von Neumann. Her father was a very famous mathematician, John von Neumann.
Well, that was computers.
Yes, he started computers. And she said to me one time, she said, oh yes, our family used to marry Jews whenever they ran out of money. What she didn't tell me, what I don't think she knew, was that her father was 100% Jewish. Both of his parents were Jews.
Oh.
They had converted after he was born.
Oh.
But she, and they had taken, the von had been given to them by the monarchy or something, but she never would have traced her Jewish line because she didn't know it.
She didn't, yeah.
Right.
But she would, if she tried to trace him, she wouldn't have found anything because she would be looking in the wrong place.
Because the records would be kept separately in Europe, of course, by religion.
Well, how did you find out?
Because a book has been written by a lady named Katie Martin about 7 Jewish men from Hungary who changed the world, and one of them was John von Neumann. That's right. You would know from computers. He called it computing machines.
Yeah. Well, that's what they are. That's what that's what they were.
Right. Exactly.
That's all they did.
So sure, there's. Or Arthur Kurzweil, who started Jewish Genealogy, really one of the ones who started, he didn't know that 2 generations back he came from a line of eminent rabbis. It had been lost in the family. So you have to, keep kind of your eyes and ears open and ask and ask and ask.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Sid's father often said, there was a rabbi in his family, but I think now, I don't think so much that there was a rabbi in the family as they were Kohanim. And he wouldn't have known enough to put the two together.
Maybe.
That's my theory, at least at this point. Because
yes, I have that. One of my grandmother's brothers was supposed to be a well-known Rav. I'm still trying to find that well-known.
Well, Rav, there's so many of them.
I have, it's at the back of my mind. Yeah. And
someday you'll come across the name.
Some of these stories have come true. I have found it, and it's very exciting when you do.
Oh, yes. And as you said, that grain of truth that you're still looking for. Why would somebody have been saying that he was a rabbi or a Rav, an educated person, if there wasn't something to it?
Oh, yeah.
So it could have been, with just Rav, it could have been that he was a rabbi, or it could have been just that he was well educated.
Oh, or the descendants of the Vilna Gaon. Everybody wants to be a descendant of the Vilna Gaon, and supposedly my Amders have some connection. I didn't believe it. Well, I finally found it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it just takes one daughter to have married somebody else, and
right. So you don't discard. You don't say, oh well, that's only an old grandmother's tale. You keep those. Those are very special. But you remember not to take them at face value. But don't think that. Remember, they're hypotheses, not facts.
Yeah, and that's what you need to ask. Your grandmother or whoever you're talking to. Are there any old stories about the family that you remember, or
right,
that somebody did something special or something like that?
The other thing I would caution people is if they have immigrants that they're talking to, and they're trying to, and they get a name of a place in the so-called old country, be sure to ask some details about where that place is located. What's the nearest big city? Is it on a river? What are the other nearby towns? Because lots of names are given that you can't find on a map.
And sometimes there's 2 or 3 towns, even in the same country, with the same name.
In Poland.
Springfield. I mean, just think of Springfield, and there's no state in the Union that doesn't have a town of Springfield.
Right. In Germany, every principality had the same names. In Poland, there were 50 Yanovs.
Yeah, so you need to know which one.
Ivanovs. There were just lots and lots, yes. So pinning down the geography is probably as important as anything, because you won't be able to go tracing backwards in time unless you know where to look.
Yeah. That's so important. Unless they eventually, 50 years from now, get everything online from all of the countries, and then you can go through and find, oh, here's that person.
I never expected the Berlin Wall to come down in my lifetime, so I don't say that's impossible. But to think of getting everything online.
Well, who would have thought anything that we're doing with DNA or anything today was 5 years ago was incredible.
Okay, here's the other thing. When you start, my advice would be to have 4 folders or 4 notebooks, 1 for each grandparent. And then as you get started, you start making more folders. You have 8 for the 8 great-grandparents. But I started with the 4. And of course, when we first started out, we were blocked because of the Soviet Union. So we could, in my case, I had 1 line that I could pursue. But now I can pursue all of them.
Yeah.
You go, at first you follow where the road takes you, you know. And if you get blocked in one place, try something else.
And I want to say, well, we're still talking about interviewing, but yeah, get it onto a computer too.
Oh, yes.
Get it organized.
And nobody does research now who doesn't use the web. I mean, everything we learned about doing research has been thrown upside down. But we'll get onto that with documents. But of course,
this comes before you can do anything on the web. This comes before you can look it up, because you have to know who to look up.
That's right.
So you have to know where to start.
And remember to keep going back to talk to people.
And look back over your old notes, too.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I found things, and on somebody else's birth certificate, Roseanne Leeson was looking, and she said, oh, my God, that's my ancestor right there. He was a brother of my ancestor, and he was signed as a witness. So,
oh, yes, because when you started out, you didn't know it.
Yeah, of course not. It was just a name.
You go back again, and suddenly you see things you wouldn't have seen before. Nature rewards the prepared mind. Remember.
Okay. So we got to do the same thing when we're talking to someone and have all of that in mind. Is there anything else? We've just got a couple of seconds left.
Tell people that if they remember something later, to get back in touch with you, please.
Oh, yes, if they will.
And it's better to interview in person, but if you can't, talk to them on the telephone.
Yeah.
Writing is the least best.
Yeah, because you're not there to see their expressions or something that makes them sad.
Right.
Well, I think that covers interviewing.
We hope.
We hope, for right now.